Former VBS chairperson Tshifhiwa Matodzi has come out with an earth-shattering affidavit related to the VBS scandal and saga. Let's get into its implications, its meaning, and the background to the VBS saga. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, I'm Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. My, not a day goes by when there isn't something fascinating and earth-shattering going on in South African politics. And this time, it's further detail on the VBS, the sordid VBS scandal, which has rocked South African politics, the banking sector, the state, since it was outed in 2018. Now, this is a fascinating scandal and a saga. There's been important investigative reporting, which has brought out some of the details of this situation. But I also think that many things have been lost in the reporting on this situation. And so what I'd like to do in this episode is try to give you a handle on the situation, also point you to some resources that you can use to educate yourself on the VBS scandal. So I'm going to start with the background to this scandal. Where are we? You've probably heard the term VBS. What does it mean? What are its origins? Secondly, I want to go into the Matodzi affidavit, place it in its legal context. What is this affidavit? Why is it coming now? Where does it fit within the broader trial of those who are on trial for various crimes related to VBS? And then also look at the implications of this politically, yes, and including for the EFF, Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu, but more widely in terms of the political implications, because this scandal has political implications for multiple parties, multiple government institutions, and indeed multiple private sector institutions. And one has to keep one's eye on multiple balls when dealing with this saga. So let's get into it. And the first thing I think that's important is the background. And one of the things that maybe distinguishes this scandal or story from other stories is just how complex it is. Firstly, you need to understand what's going on inside of a bank. Then you need to understand the regulatory failures. And there are multiple reports going on around it. So this is how I would best advise someone to get their head around this story. The first is, of course, Advocate Terry Mudau's report commissioned by the South African Reserve Bank, which really goes into what went wrong at VBS. And this was the starting point. You know, many people have got plaudits for explaining what's going on in VBS. I think Advocate Terry Mudau requires a lot of praise for the work he did in this investigative report from SARS. And that was really the starting point, and people have from then, gone into various details that came out of the report. You've then got a report of the PIC, and the PIC is a very important body. It's, I think, the biggest asset manager on the African continent or something like that. It manages all the funds of the South African civil service, and it ended up being an investor in VBS. And so there was a commission of inquiry into the PIC, a lot of which dealt with what happened at VBS. So that report by Judge Lex Mpati. And then there was a subsequent report which went into further details about VBS, which the PIC and flowed also from the Mpati Commission. So those three documents are key. And then we've got, as a result of those documents and further criminal investigation, as well as investigative journalist, we've got various trials and other kind of legal proceedings which are going on all around this. So it's a complicated topic and it's a complicated subject, and it's one we might have to revisit because it'll be impossible to cover all of it in one episode. But the background is basically this. VBS is a mutual bank which actually draws its origins from Bantustan apartheid South Africa. It actually traces to unequal land relations. So basically in former Bantustans, these were the homelands that the apartheid government tried to create as kind of quasi-independent entities under apartheid, to say that, oh, no, black people have their own states, everything is fine, right? In those former homelands, people didn't actually genuinely own land to the extent that land was actually in their possession. What persisted was a kind of colonial land occupation system in which you occupied the land, so you were on the land, but the state was the ultimate owner of the land. So you never had direct ownership of the land, although you were entitled to occupy it. And therefore, you couldn't trade the land that you were on or the property that was on that land in a similar way that you would if you directly owned it. In other words, you couldn't get a loan for it. You couldn't use it as collateral for like a home loan, for example. So what VBS did in the homeland system was devise a system in which they were able to give loans to people who occupied this land, even if they didn't directly own it. So that's how VBS started in the homeland system. It was a way to try and give financial power to people who didn't directly own their land because of unequal land relationships. And this was in, I think, the early 1980s. But let's fast forward, because unfortunately those land relations haven't really changed, even in democracy, which is a sad indictment on where we are as a country. But that's a story for another day. Let's go into the democratic era. After a while, as we move into the 2010s, VBS seems to be limping along, and it's not doing very well as a business. And at that point, there are various attempts to take over the bank, take over its ownership, and reposition the bank so that it can become profitable again. And so as the bank is sliding, and as the vendor king comes into office after a long court battle, basically there is an attempt by a series of business people who have origins within Limpopo to take over control of the bank. First, it's through a vehicle called Njambeu, I think, and this is where Tshifhiwa Matodzi comes in, because he is the key figure in all of this. He is accused number one, and he is the person who is the key orchestrator of all that happens with this shocking VBS scandal. And he comes in as someone seeing this bank limping along and seizing an opportunity to really take it over. And first there's this consortium with the vendor king and various other players and business people in Limpopo, and they take over a certain portion of the bank. The PIC had already retained ownership in the bank via its former ownership in the Bantustan bank system, so it had ownership, and then the depositors themselves had various forms of ownership. But the crazy thing is, and this story is so fascinating, you literally need to read these books. Read the book by Dewald van Rensburg, VBS: A Dream Defrauded. This vehicle, which took over VBS, Njambeu I think it's called, actually suspended Tshifhiwa Matodzi because they were like, he was acting weird and doing all kinds of crazy things. And it'd be a fascinating alternative history would be what happened if they followed through with that suspension. But eventually the vendor king persuaded them, no, Matodzi must come back, bring him back into the situation. And when Matodzi came back after being suspended, not only was he able to take over VBS, but he was able to sideline this consortium that had brought him in the first place and relegate them to minority ownership. And he eventually ended up running a company called Vele Investments, which became the majority shareholder in VBS. And how it happened is just, it boggles the mind, right? Check this. So he's a minority shareholder in this consortium. Now, this consortium says they want a new chair of the board of VBS, right? But it's not Matodzi, it's someone else. Everyone gets to this meeting where they're going to elect a new chair, and suddenly Matodzi gets nominated, not from this consortium, but from outside. And ordinary shareholders of VBS, who, because it's a mutual bank, have a stake at the AGM, had been coordinated by Matodzi outside. He worked the ground so that these ordinary shareholders coordinated themselves to nominate him against the candidate from the consortium that he was in. And eventually, Matodzi gets elected as the chairperson of VBS. And his consortium is like, what are you doing? Like, we agreed on another candidate. Now you suddenly create yourself as a parallel candidate and you win this election. Lots of fights happen, etc. But again, that consortium is persuaded, no, just let this Matodzi guy do what he's doing. He probably knows what he's doing, etc. Matodzi, incidentally, comes from a corporate background in South Africa. He studied to be an accountant. He was a CA. He did his articles at KPMG, if I'm not mistaken, and then he also went on to work for Sizwe Gobodo and Ernst & Young. So he came through that track, very traditional corporate track, and various of the people around Matodzi also were all accountants. They were from UJ, and there was this group of UJ alumni, like the first black accountants who were really thrust into corporate South Africa. And there was a lot of expectation and hope about what this generation would do. Well, now we see how it turned out. So Matodzi engineers himself into the chairpersonship of VBS. And then, if that isn't enough, he creates this company, Vele Investments, that somehow, and it's still unclear exactly how Vele was able to do this because it wasn't a shareholder before, is able to, in the space of about a year, go from 4% shareholding to 50% shareholding in the bank. And what seems to have happened is that Matodzi, as chairperson of VBS, created loans or deposits or fraudulent transactions into Vele, and then used those transactions into Vele to buy shareholding into VBS. So it looked like Vele had all this money, but the money was actually VBS's money that Matodzi, through his position as chair in VBS, siphoned into Vele, and then Vele used that money to buy shareholding into VBS. So you can see that there was this crazy incestuous financial relationship where someone used their influence on the bank to put money in their own investment vehicle, and then that investment vehicle used that bank money to come back and gain shareholding in the bank, to the point where eventually the shareholding was half the shareholding in the bank. So even just in the process of Matodzi being able to be the kingpin of the VBS racket, there was some crazy stuff going on. And it's a pity that it didn't get found earlier or spotted earlier by regulators, who I think also have a lot of questions to answer about how they missed so much. So that's the background, and that's the reason why Matodzi is so important, because he is in many ways the mastermind behind all of this. Everyone else was in large part following his orders. So what then happens after Matodzi gains control of VBS? What happens is, in a previous video and episode that I did when I was standing in for the late great Eusebius Mkhize on 702, I tried to analyze the Mutau report that had just come out there, and I said that there were 3 concurrent conspiracies that flowed, right, from the period that Matodzi took over VBS, which was around 2015, until its eventual collapse in 2018. And we need to understand these conspiracies. But the more I've read, now I think there are actually 4 concurrent, parallel, and intertwined conspiracies. So the first conspiracy is obviously inside the bank. Because if you're going to commit fraud and you're going to create false transactions and you're going to pretend that there's money where there isn't really money, and you're going to present yourself as being more profitable than you really are, you have to get the people inside the bank to go along with it. And this is the primary conspiracy, right? And of course, it's a tightly kept secret that you have to present to other people and fool or bribe regulators and auditors and all of that. So there's a conspiracy inside the bank. Then there's a conspiracy between the bank and the government and the state, especially the state in Limpopo. And there's a conspiracy between various municipalities in Limpopo and VBS, where municipalities start banking with VBS, start using VBS funds. Various politicians get paid off to use VBS funds. And it turns out it's actually illegal, because municipalities can't bank with mutual banks. They can only bank with ordinary or well-established banks. So you have to pay off all these politicians in order to make sure that they give you money. So you're paying the politicians so that the budgets they control come to your bank. So that's the second conspiracy, right? Then there's a third conspiracy, which is with state institutions outside of Limpopo, which is your attempts to persuade the Reserve Bank, which didn't go very well, attempts to persuade Treasury that there was regulatory compliance. And there's some interesting revelations in this affidavit from Matodzi, which we'll get into. Attempts also to persuade private sector actors auditing state institutions and auditing the bank. So the auditors of VBS. And so You have to convince people in the bank, then you have to bribe politicians to give you the funds, and then those who are looking into this also have to be bribed or persuaded through monetary gratification that they should turn a blind eye or delay or give some kind of concession. And that is across regulatory institutions and some private institutions. And then finally, you have through that an attempt to influence political parties, and in particular the ANC, but we'll also get onto the EFF after this as well. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. Because you need political influence in order to convince state functionaries who are tied to the political party to fulfill your ambitions and your aspirations. So there are lots of different things going on at once. First, to create the fraud and corruption, up to 2 billion. But then, on top of that, you have to cover it all up, right? So there's a conspiracy to defraud, and then there's a conspiracy to cover up, and all these parties and players are involved in those actions. So as you can see, there was a lot going on, and there are a lot of moving parts in this. One curious question is why VBS has dominated headlines and really got all this attention when we know that there are other forms of corruption in South Africa. And partly it's just how brazen the scheme was, how much conspicuous consumption there was. People had helicopters and Ferraris, and they weren't hiding how much money they had personally. The other is clearly the personalities involved, and we'll get onto the EFF, but clearly, once you implicate someone as well known as Julius Malema, that's going to drive clicks and newspaper sales. So it involves conspicuous consumption, it involves famous people, and it is an interesting, fascinating, and sordid story. But in terms of the actual real numbers, some perspective is also necessary. So like Steinhoff, we're talking, I think, over 100 billion rand, right, of what are thought of as fraudulent transactions. The Gupta Empire, like it's at this point unquantifiable how much money, but we know it was, some have put state capture in the trillions, others, again, hundreds of billions. We're talking about 2.2 billion rands here. So in terms of different scandals, this is maybe not the biggest one in monetary terms, but that doesn't mean that it isn't ethically equally interesting to look into. And the fact of the matter is, fraud is fraud, no matter if it's 10 million or 2 billion or 100 trillion for that matter. Now, having tried to set the scene in terms of what was going on and who this affidavit comes from and why it's important, let's get into the affidavit itself, and then we'll get into some of its implications. But one thing I think is key here, which may in some ways be lost in the public debate, is what are the legal implications? Where did this fit? And what is this affidavit, right? And there we need to look into the law of criminal procedure. So there is a criminal trial at the moment, which involves not only Matodzi, but also various executives from VBS, board members like the PIC board member who is on the board, and also board members in VBS. There was a board member who is also the chief financial officer of the South African Police Service. So all the people that were effectively around Matodzi, and senior ANC politicians like Dan Msiza, who is a key ANC politician in the Limpopo province, who allegedly collaborated with Matodzi to create all these municipalities, giving VBS this money. Now, originally they were all tried together, right? But we're still in the pre-trial phase. So in a criminal trial, you have a pre-trial phase, and that deals with like securing the accused to court, making sure that there are pleas. Are they pleading guilty? Are they pleading not guilty, etc.? And once you've got that out the way, then you start with the actual criminal trial, where you call witnesses, etc. And then after that, there's sentencing. But in the pre-trial phase, there are various things that can happen which have happened in this case. One of the things that can happen is that the accused can be split from the group. So if a group of people are being tried together, some people can be split away. And that can often happen if they break ranks, right? And we've already seen that with the former VBS executive, Philip Truter, who is one of the people who is apparently manipulating bank records. People were literally manipulating bank records, being like, I'm a bank. I can just say this account is credited. Oops, now it's credited. I'll figure out later how, we make up for that. Like literally just completely using bank facilities to create fictitious money in people's accounts. So Truter was one of the people, and he pleaded guilty. He was the first person to turn in this trial, and his trial was then split away. He pleaded guilty and he was sentenced. By the way, I believe he's now out on parole, about 3-4 years later. So after defrauding VBS, if you really want to talk about accountability and people, Philip Truter only served 3 years for his role in this whole saga. But that's our criminal justice system. He went in, he did a plea bargain. When you plea and you do a plea bargain, you convince the NPA not to be too harsh on you. You maybe convince the judge not to give you a harsh sentence, and then parole comes up and you leave. So he was, I think, sentenced to an effective 7 years, but that was brought down through parole, and he also benefited from special remission. Anyway, coming back to the main narrative. So Truter split away from the main trial. Now Matodzi has split away. And why is that? Because Matodzi has entered into a plea agreement with the NPA. And what does that mean? He is going to say, you know what, save yourself the effort of trying to prove all these allegations against me in a trial by calling witnesses. I am going to admit and make admissions that will result in my sentence. But by doing so, I'm going to ask that the NPA, it's a bargain. So the NPA has to give me certain things, and hopefully my sentence will be lesser because I have cooperated. And therefore you can try all the rest of these people, but I am going to be separated out from that because of this plea agreement. Now, as far as I'm aware, we actually don't have the contents of the plea agreement between Matodzi and the NPA, but what we have is his affidavit where he makes admissions about various charges that were going to be brought against him. So that's the document that got leaked to the public. And yes, the NPA has said it's a terrible thing that it leaked, but the fact of the matter is, now that we have it, we need to analyze it. So it was an affidavit wherein he makes admissions about the charges that were going to be brought against him. In return for the NPA maybe not bringing other charges, or maybe not suggesting other forms of punishment, for basically not going as hard as the NPA may have wanted to go. And maybe they threatened him and said, look, if you don't go into this agreement, threatened him not directly, but the bargain was probably, look, if you plead guilty, then these are the benefits which will flow to you. And also in return for hopefully a lesser sentence. And he now has an effective sentence of 15 years. And of course, who knows what parole might mean in terms of when he eventually comes out. So there is something to be said for how seriously to take this evidence as far as it implicates other people. Because in criminal trials, this kind of admission evidence in plea bargaining is not particularly persuasive evidence as far as it relates to third parties, right? So the executives he implicates, the politicians he implicates, the other people he implicates. And the reason for that is fairly obvious. It's that if you are bargaining to get a lesser sentence, you might throw other people under the bus for your own ends and your own motives. Doesn't mean that your evidence doesn't point prosecutors or investigators in new directions, which they might well pursue, but it means that that specific affidavit itself needs to be treated with what is called caution in criminal procedural law. So when you plea for a lesser sentence, it's often not particularly persuasive evidence in and of itself that you are now implicating other people. And presumably those people's lawyers will get up when this affidavit is put to them, if it even is put to them by the prosecution, and say, well, this has to be treated with the cautionary predisposition that is required of this evidence. However, having said that, in terms of technical criminal procedure, that does not mean in terms of the public debate that this affidavit is meaningless. It is meaningful because we have an admission from the person who was accused by these various reports, investigative reporting, of participating in this conspiracy, confirming that they did, in fact, participate in this conspiracy in many similar and, in fact, many identical ways as the reports have suggested. So that matters in terms of the public debate. And we should always also separate the public debate from the criminal trial. So what will happen now? Well, I believe the criminal trial is proceeding, and it will be very interesting to see whether other accused decide to also go into plea agreements, or whether the NPA is satisfied with just the two, Trita and Matodzi, and then will use those two and then prosecute the others without any plea agreements. Or whether those others will enter into plea agreements, and if they do, what kind of things they will reveal to the NPA, and in turn, whether that will be revealed to South Africans, or whether we'll have to wait for the trial to see that. But I'm fairly certain that when the trial happens, I'm sure all eyes will be peeled on the criminal trial. So we've looked at the origins of VBS. We've looked at what this trial means and Matodzi's affidavit. Now, the affidavit itself, as we move on to the third section, the affidavit itself just says crazy and wild things about so many actors. I want to start with the EFF because obviously that's where a lot of public attention has been turned. But I don't just want to stop with the EFF because I think there's a danger in the story of making it about the EFF when this is a much bigger story than just the EFF or Julius Malema or Floyd Shivambu. But let's start there. What happened with the EFF is it is alleged in the affidavit that VBS, through Vele Investments, remember that vehicle that Matodzi set up to gain a fraudulent shareholdingship in VBS, which ultimately was a majority shareholdingship. Through Vele, money was channeled to the EFF, according to Matodzi, so that they would stop criticizing VBS. And why were they criticizing VBS at the time? This takes us to the Nkandla situation. Remember, the Concourt ruled that Jacob Zuma had violated his oath of office by receiving undue benefits for his Nkandla residence. Now, the Concourt told him to pay back the money. And the EFF, remember, in Parliament was very vociferous about the need for Zuma to pay back the money. How did Zuma pay back the money? Well, he said he got a loan to pay it back. Where did he get the loan from? He got the loan from a little-known bank at the time called VBS. So VBS was saying, hey, EFF, according to Matodzi's allegations, this is not good for us. This is not good for our PR. Can we talk about this? And we want to donate to the EFF. And it seems that Matodzi is implying that he was giving the EFF or its leaders money so that they would dampen or silence their criticism about VBS as a bank. Now, we've had investigative reporting that money went from Vele into an account or into a company called Scamega, and Scamega was owned by Brian Shivambu, who's one of Floyd Shivambu's 7 siblings. So Matodzi in this affidavit confirms that money went from Vele to Scamega. And other reporting has shown how, or has suggested how money went from Scamega to other accounts linked directly to EFF leaders or close to them. So from Scamega into something called Grand Azania, which seems to be some kind of restaurant that Floyd Shivambu owned or a company owned that was trying to build some kind of restaurant, to Mahuna Investments, which is a company linked to one of Julius Malema's cousins. And so the flow of money is, as is alleged in Matodzi's affidavit, which goes along with investigative reporting, as it went from Vele, from VBS unlawfully to Vele. Then once it was in Vele, it went to Scamega. And once it was in Scamega, it went to these other accounts, which then went to benefit people who are close to EFF leaders. And the allegation is, therefore, those EFF leaders themselves, perhaps using those individuals as front individuals for their own interests. But again, that part needs to be further corroborated and proved. But Matodzi says the transaction to Scamega happened, and he further says it happened not for the reason that there was some contract between Scamega and Vele for legitimate business ends, but as a gratification to EFF leaders. Now, why does that word gratification matter? Well, if you look at PRECA, which is the act dealing with corruption in South Africa, PRECA uses that term gratification. So when a lawyer looks at that, they're saying that Matodzi is trying to implicate either Floyd Shivambu or Julius Malema maybe, but at least Shivambu and or Julius Malema in forms of corruption, because he's suggesting that this money wasn't given for a legitimate purpose, like a political party donation or for work done by Scamega, but was a gratification, which is the language used in PRECA. And what is a gratification? That's to do with corruption, where you receive money for an ulterior purpose and you use your public power to institute that purpose for the money you received. So corruption is really a crime which is to do with money and power. Someone gives you money or a form of gratification, and then you use your power, which you got actually via the electorate, for the end of the person who gave you the money, not for the end of the public good. And that's called a gratification. So what Matodzi is trying to suggest is somehow that the money he gave to Scamega was not for any legitimate purpose other than for the illegitimate purpose of gratification. Now, it's interesting because in the book, A Dream Defrauded, he actually said something different. According to the author Dewald van Rensburg, this is what Matodzi said. He said the brouhaha around Malema and Shivambu getting VBS money is just politicking. Quote, in VBS there are so many politicians, ANC, SACP, but why pick the EFF? You can see it's a strategy. There are so many people there. These people applied, they have loans. It's so sad, these guys, they make a loan application on one side. I think one was a building loan. I think it was a nightclub, Grand Azania or what. So you advance somebody a loan, etc. So in the book, he says all of this is sad and is politicking. But now in his affidavit, he has said, no, it was a gratification given to Malema and Shivambu. And he says in the affidavit, and I want to read it, it's paragraphs 27.1 to 27.6. EFF had started a campaign of mentioning VBS in its political rallies through its president, Julius Malema. As chairman of VBS, I then decided that Malema and EFF should be approached for VBS to explain its position and how the loan was granted. Gogoro, which was VBS PR consultants, arranged a meeting for me to meet with Julius at the EFF's penthouse in Sandton. Does the EFF just have a penthouse? Whose penthouse is this? EFF penthouse? Do they own the penthouse in Sandton? That's interesting. I went there alone. Present there was Julius Malema, Floyd Shivambu, and Marshall Dlamini, who's current Secretary General of the EFF, but he wasn't SG then. Marshall Dlamini did not participate in the meeting, and he was seated far away from where the engagement took place. He then says he explained VBS's position and the fact that EFF's negative commentary in paragraph 27.3 was impacting badly on VBS, and he would therefore want to offer, he said we had the same constituency, and therefore he wanted to offer some money. Now, he said he would donate 5 million immediately and 1 million, but his condition, and this is interesting, was that a VBS bank account had to be opened in order for this money to be deposited. So he went to the EFF according to his affidavit, cautionary rules notwithstanding, etc. And he said to the EFF, I'm willing to donate, but in order for my donation, you have to open a VBS bank account. And this is where Scamega comes in, because Scamega then, I understand, opened a bank account at VBS. And then the money was transferred into Scamega's VBS bank account. That's what the affidavit says. Anyway, now he then also says that subsequent payments were made to Scamega's VBS account every month and were paid from Vele or Vele subsidiaries. Now, this is the crucial part. He says, myself, Julius, and Floyd understood that the concept of donation meant gratification. Hence, Floyd and Julius did not provide me with the EFF's own banking details for these, what he calls donations. So what he's saying there is that there he's trying to make the implication that this wasn't a legitimate donation to a political party. This wasn't the normal kind of thing that we see in politics where companies give to political parties every day. This was some kind of personal gratification to the leaders, and that's why it didn't go to the EFF account. It went to these other company accounts and then was channeled to EFF leaders for them to use it for illegitimate purposes and their own financial needs rather than party needs. Now, these are things that clearly I think EFF leaders, like I've said since 2018, need to answer, right? I'm not prepared to suggest that this affidavit now provides conclusive proof, because that would be to jump the gun. But I think the dismissive nature of the EFF at this point is not doing them any favors. And I understand from their perspective, they feel it's unfair. They feel that lots of political parties have got donations and this kind of thing happens all the time. But the fact of the matter is that as a political party, you are in the public domain and public opinion starts to matter. And so no matter whether you think it's an enemy that has implicated you, you have a duty to respond to the public who wants these questions answered. And I do think there are questions to be answered about why the money went from Vele to Skameka. Was there a legitimate purpose? Now, there's this contract on which Brian Shivambu has relied previously. But another important part of the Matodzi affidavit that needs a response and a reply, and maybe this is why it's slightly unfair, because in a court process and in a trial, you then get to reply to that, right? And people can be brought in as witnesses, and you can use the procedural fairness of the courtroom to respond. Whereas when things get leaked in the media before a trial and all of that, then it's actually unfair because you can't respond in the usual way. But the EFF does need to explain the money that came from Vele, why did it go to Skameka? Was there a legitimate contract? Now, the EFF says there was a legitimate contract, but if we go to paragraph 27.6, after VBS was placed under curatorship, says Matodzi, I met Floyd and his younger brother Brian several times at Floyd's residence in Bryanston. This was the first time I met Brian. At one of the meetings, myself, Floyd, and Brian agreed to regularize the 5 million plus 1 million monthly donations. Interestingly, here he doesn't put donations in quotation marks, as he does in earlier paragraphs. It was agreed amongst us that we draft a contract between Vele and Skameka for consulting work in petroleum and storage facilities. The said contract, which we backdated by agreement, was drafted by the Shivambu brothers. Signatories to the contract were myself, representing Vele, and Brian, representing Skameka. And there's actually a copy of this contract. You can go into the leaked affidavit and you can go and read the contract. And indeed, there is a contract there for the services suggested. But what Matodzi is alleging is that that contract only came later to justify the payments in the first place, so that when it became evident that this dubious money was going to these entities and that these entities were linked to EFF leaders, there was a post hoc scramble to try and justify the payment as if it was some kind of contract. And the question then is, what work was done? Was it legitimate? Were people paid for the work? How much were they paid? And all of that. So I do think that the EFF does have questions to answer. EFF leaders do have questions to answer. Now, yes, to be fair to them, they have answered these questions before. So Julius Malema had a very long press conference at which he invited anyone to come and ask him questions. And I think that's a good thing. And great journalists like Samkele Maseko and Matsidiso Madia and Mahlatsi asked very probing questions. And Malema responded to those questions. And I think that's great. But the fact of the matter is that when new allegations emerge or when a different light is placed on old allegations, I think there is a responsibility to then, again, respond again as a public representative and as a political official. And this is one of the problems I have with President Ramaphosa, by the way, who has never answered questions on Phala Phala or subjected himself to probing questions in public. As a public representative, it's your duty to continue to reassure the public. And if you can't reassure the public, then the public, has questions in their mind. So I think Matodzi's affidavit does cast questions again over why the money was paid into this account, for what purpose was it paid, and to what extent were these gratification payments. On the other hand, political parties we have to be honest about this, receive funds all the time. And, Helen Ziller, there's a letter where she thanks the Gupta family for funding the DA. We also know that this is not just a story about the EFF, right? And what I think is unfair, having said what I've already said, and I don't want to be misread as deflecting because I've dealt with the EFF question at length here. What I think is unfair is to pretend that the EFF was in on the conspiracy inside the bank, because that's a separate question. Did they receive money from VBS or VBS-linked entities? It looks like they may have, and then they need to explain that. But there's certain reporting which suggests that they were somehow in on VBS defrauding its depositors and knew in advance and actually looted the money from the depositors. And I think that is truly unfair. The South African Reserve Bank did not know at the time. Maybe they should have known. VBS auditors did not know what was going on at the time. VBS employees did not know what was going on at the time. VBS depositors did not know what was going on at the time. You're telling me the EFF somehow was able to conduct a forensic audit of VBS and figure out that this grand conspiracy was ongoing and actually benefited from it knowingly? I haven't seen any evidence to that effect. So I do think that is potentially unfair on the EFF to suggest that they were participants in the defrauding of VBS depositors. Yes, they benefited from that defrauding, as some may suggest, right? Or some might suggest they benefited, but it's different benefiting from something unknowingly than being a participant in that defrauding process. Let's take it to some other kind of example. Some mine gives money to the MK party or the ACDP, right? And they accept that money. It later turns out that the mine was involved in criminality or illegality or fraud or whatever, right? Now, having accepted that money, it would be the duty of that party to say, pay it back, for example, and I believe some of the money has been paid back. It would be the duty, once you subsequently realize, to pay that money back. But it's not your duty to know what's going on inside the company once you get that money, right? So I do think that's a little bit unfair to say that, oh no, the ACDP or the MK party in this analogy conspired in the fraud of the mine. No, they didn't know about that. It emerged later, and you have to draw that distinction, I think. That's only fair. Okay, so having dealt with the EFF, right, and having dealt with what the affidavit says about EFF leaders and the aspersions that it casts over them and the need for them to reply and to the satisfaction of the Republic on that, and also to the satisfaction probably of EFF members, because one of the allegations is that this money eventually reaches EFF leaders, but it doesn't go to the party, or maybe some of it goes to the party, but others go to personal expenses, which is also something that internal EFF questions would be asked about. If this money was supposed to come to us and as a party, and if we rely on donations, how much actually reached us before we knew about the VBS conspiracy and the fraud. Sorry, just one more thing on this EFF thing. There was also a parliamentary inquiry which found that there wasn't appropriate disclosure on the part of Floyd Shivambu. EFF spokesperson Sinawa Tambo then said they were going to challenge that in court. I'm not sure whether that's been challenged or not. So there's also a question of, even if the money flowed appropriately and everything was normal, it was a normal political donation to the extent that it was a donation, then why was it not appropriately disclosed within Parliament, etc.? And Parliament has sanctioned Floyd Shivambu. I think it docked 9 days of his salary or something like that, and that was last year. So, having said that, and maybe I've fallen into the trap myself, this story is not about the EFF. Yes, there is a fascinating story about the EFF which the EFF needs to answer and which has dented the credibility of the EFF. But 2.2 billion rands is at stake here. And there's a massive story, firstly, about the ANC, which actually did participate in the conspiracy and knew what was going on in the bank as far as the conspiracy relating to municipalities. It seems clear that the only way VBS could have possibly persuaded Limpopo municipalities to put all that money into VBS is if there was a political conspiracy with VBS between Matodzi and Mr. Msiza, at least as it's alleged in the affidavit, that they conspired to take this money that was illegal to be placed in VBS because it wasn't an ordinary bank, and just did it anyway. And when the SARB came back, and when Treasury came back and said, hold on a second, there's this act which says that mutual banks cannot get money from municipalities, which is good, right? Because the regulations on mutual banks are not the same as the big banks, for example. When SARB came back, there was another attempt to use political influence to make regulators overlook this conspiracy. That's the major interface between politics and VBS. And it's ANC and VBS. It's Limpopo ANC and VBS. And sadly, that has been lost. Somehow, the ANC has been able to turn this into a story about the EFF. And credit to them for being able to do that. But I really want to know, and Mr. Msiza is one of the accused. He's actually on trial right now. How it was that Limpopo was able to participate in this conspiracy between municipalities and the bank when they knew it was illegal. That's what really dented the depositors at the end of the day. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. Now, we also know that the VBS, or at least Matodzi in his affidavit, and it hasn't been denied, made payments to the ANC as a party. And in fact, there's a fascinating story because a lot of this is happening around 2017, around what role did VBS play in the 2017 elective conference. We know that they would hire tents and they would, do things for the party, like paying different accounts for the party, in addition to obviously paying and bribing mayors of these municipalities to make sure, they called them commissions, according to Matodzi, to put the money in VBS via the municipalities. And that's massive scale, right? We're not talking 16 million or 4 million or 2. We're talking hundreds of millions of rands, and VBS inflating those figures to look like billions often, right? And then using that to get funding from the PIC to the tune of massive amounts. Speaking of which, the PIC, another person who's actually in the dock, is a VBS board member who was there by virtue of being a PIC member. Now, the PIC is linked to the Ministry of Finance, and I, for the life of me, cannot understand how they allowed so much to happen, how they kept funding and refunding VBS and never really inquired into having a seat on the board. And it seems clear that Matodzi alleges that they were actually gratifying this board member to turn a blind eye. So we're dealing with massive state institutions here and massive political power. And we also have to, I'm not saying don't hold the EFF accountable, but I am saying let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here, because it's also about corporate fraud. It's about the state. It's about the governing party and opposition parties. In fact, even in The Dream Defrauded, you can go to footnote 40, which deals with some of the cross-examination which happened in the Mudau report. Remember, this was the Reserve Bank's report. And Mr. Ramabunga, who's another of the accused, I think he was the chief financial officer or operations officer, one of the key executives. Advocate Hutton asks him, "You don't fund the EFF? You don't fund the DA?" ? And he denies it there. He says, "The EFF has asked us, but I don't remember making payment to them." He says, "The DA approached us before, but I don't remember making payment there." So he says both the EFF and the DA, Mr. Ramabunga, as quoted in The Dream Defrauded, both approached the bank. So what we're dealing with here is a really shocking situation where the private sector, corporate South Africa, where regulators, let's come on to regulators, the SARB, right? South African Reserve Bank, it gets this report from VBS. And the report is basically, VBS realizes that it's basically illegal, right, to hold all these municipal deposits. It should be holding deposits from people, right, just normal people. And it submits this report to SARB, and you can actually see this graph in this report that it submits to SARB, where one moment it's getting all these deposits from the illegitimate source, and then literally the month later, suddenly it's got all these deposits from a different source. And I don't know how it took SARB so long to figure out. And surely then, when the report was submitted, they should have been like, what is going on here? You can't just suddenly transform all of your deposits overnight. So even though the SARB ultimately was very proactive when it was obvious that VBS was falling apart and it couldn't make its payments and it couldn't, people couldn't withdraw their money from the bank and they lost a lot of money. Should regulators why didn't regulators see this more early when it was becoming obvious? Treasury. Now, here's another interesting aspect. There was this whole regulatory debate, which was, can VBS or can't VBS hold these municipal deposits? And the law is very obvious. It can't, right? But VBS then said, no, let's try and use our political influence to convince Treasury that somehow we can take these deposits. And the Director General at Treasury at the time, Mr. Mohojane, who's since left, is accused by Matodzi of taking R1 million to deal with this regulatory dispute in one way or the other. Now, Mr. Mohojane has come back and said in a statement, well, actually, I ended up fighting VBS, and it's true eventually that Treasury took the view that this was illegal. But again, for this kind of fraud and corruption to happen, you need governmental participation and cooperation. And with all the bribes that were flowing around here, again, I'm going to say that this person also has questions to answer. Like, you can't just pretend that this happened without the most senior levels of government either turning a blind eye or at worst being actively complicit. Audit firms, financial firms that were looking into VBS were being paid, people. Auditors were being paid to turn a blind eye to these false transactions. So this is a story about the South African economy writ large. It's a story about how corruption goes everywhere. It goes to political parties, to the government, to local government, to provincial government, to national government. It's a story about how the regulators that are supposed to deal with this and defend citizens against this kind of thing turn a blind eye. And it's a story how the companies who present themselves as squeaky clean, as we saw in the state capture report, often are collaborators in corruption. And make no mistake, this corruption was found because it wasn't as maybe sophisticated as other forms of corruption. But where else is this happening in the economy? Who else is being paid to turn a blind eye to something? And when you look at the concentrations of wealth and power in our economy, I think we probably haven't even uncovered the full extent of corporate power and greed in South Africa. And those who've been doing it for a long time probably just have better ways of doing it than those who are newcomers to the game. There's a really interesting section in Dream Defrauded where Matodzi goes to Stellenbosch and works with various people in the banking industry, well-known figures in Stellenbosch on a project which has to do with the sale of wine or something in Stellenbosch. And there are pictures of Matodzi on famous people's farms driving their cars, and they were buddy at the time. All right, so this went deep into the South African economy as it did into politics. And Limpopo, by the way, who did they support in the 2017 elective conference? This compromised province. They supported President Cyril Ramaphosa in the run-up to the conference. So there we are. President Cyril Ramaphosa was the deputy president at the time of the country. There were reports early after VBS that people had appealed directly to him and had tried to blow the whistle and nothing was done. Now, I don't know, because those reports kind of faded. I don't know if the media faded or the reports were uncorroborated or untrue, but it would be interesting to know, did the highest levels of the government, Ramaphosa and Zuma himself, did they know about this in time? Because ultimately Zuma was the beneficiary of the loan from VBS itself. What were VBS trying to do with that loan to the president at the time he was president? So we just have to walk and chew gum at the same time on this one, and make sure that everyone is held accountable and not focus on one and not the other. So that's an attempt to break this VBS situation and story down for you. Now, what I think is interesting going forward here, what does the EFF do? What does the EFF say? They've got their 11th anniversary celebration coming up. It's a difficult time, I think, for the EFF right now. They come off an election where they would have wanted to grow. They contracted slightly. Now they face another wave of VBS criticism and condemnation and doubt. And a year ago, the EFF was riding as high as it has ever been riding. Going into its 10th anniversary celebration, remember the rally at the stadium, and it seemed like they were going to surge in electoral support. That was before the MK party came on the scene and scuppered those plans. And so EFF is in an interesting and a difficult moment right now. Let's see how the EFF responds to this. How does the ANC respond to this? Now, I saw Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni coming on our screens and saying, well, everyone must be held accountable. Well, what does that mean? Does the ANC accept its responsibility in this? Florence Radzilani, who's another politician who's implicated directly in this Matodzi affidavit, was just reappointed as an MEC in Limpopo. Just reappointed. Zizi was in parliament. So, does the ANC care or not? Because these sweeping statements are quite frankly meaningless. I'm going to be interested in what happens with this criminal trial. Do not think for a second that this is the end of the saga. There will be many twists and turns. We'll learn many more things. And of course, those who are implicated will be able to respond, the accused particularly, and I'll be fascinated to see what will Mr. Msiza say? What will Mr. Ramabunga say? What will the PIC reps say and those who are also implicated? Philip Truter, will he speak out now that he's going to be released or has been released on parole? What other things will be leaked? It's clear as day that there is a strategy to strategically leak documents. You don't get a leak from the NPA like this very often. And so the NPA has obviously come out and condemned the leak, but what other leaks will we see and where did they come from? Who is doing the leaking? Who did the leaking from within VBS? So I think we're still going to learn a lot, and Matodzi himself may now be a witness for the state. And so when we hear that evidence and when we hear him taking the witness stand and actually telling us in his own words what he saw, that's going to be a fascinating moment in South African politics too. Now, on this channel, I always say this, and I'll never get tired of saying it. I present you one perspective. There is no one who gives you an absolutely objective perspective except the Most High, in the world. So I'm not saying that I know everything about the VBS saga or that my perspective is the right one. It's a different and it's a new and it's a slightly different perspective that you'll get in other places. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't read those other perspectives, but what I would suggest is take my view, take other people's views, and form your own view yourself. I've given you the resources that you need to use to form that view, and I would start with the Mudau report, the PIC report, and the PIC's subsequent report that flowed from that, the Matodzi affidavit itself, and also the investigative journalism and reporting that's gone into this. And all of those give you a slightly different picture and come from different perspectives. And then you can make your mind up. I'd also commend A Dream Defrauded by Dewald van Rensburg, which is one of the books that has been published on this situation. And that's my take on this saga. Now, we will continue to follow this story, and we will make sure that we update and continue to analyze this. But that doesn't mean that we're also not going to analyze other things. And so once again, if Phala Phala drops, I've seen this narrative that somehow you must choose between VBS and Phala Phala. No, we must focus on both. We're also going to focus on that. So anyone who thinks this channel is going to stop holding other people accountable, you will be sadly disappointed. We're not going to bow to pressure to try and appease some while we focus on others. We're going to try and do it all at the same time. And I think that's ultimately, in my view, what's missing in the South African media landscape, that there are very few platforms and publications who are able to do both at the same time. Like, share, comment down below. We have a fascinating comment section where there's usually a lot of good faith commentary, criticism, agreement, disagreement. What do you think about the Matodzi affidavit? What do you think it means? What do you think are its implications? What did you learn from today? And have you looked into the worrying, terrifying, creepy, and sad origins of the VBS conspiracy? A situation in which a bank was robbed by its own owners. Aye.